And we're going to continue with the fifth chapter of Mary Poppins. It's called The New One because a new baby has arrived at number 17, Cherry Tree Lane. And we will continue. Mary Poppins stooped over the new cradle between John and Barbara's cots and laid the bundle of blankets carefully in it. "Here you are at last! Bless my beak and tail feathers! I thought you were never coming. Which is it?" cried a croaking voice from the window. Mary Poppins looked up. The Starling, who lived on top of the chimney, was hopping excitedly on the window-sill. "A girl, Annabel," said Mary Poppins shortly, "and I'll thank you to be a little quieter, squawking and croaking there like a packet of magpies." But the Starling was not listening. He was turning somersaults on the window-sill, clapping his wings wildly together each time his head came up. "What a treat!" he panted, when he at last stood up straight. "What a treat! Oh, I could sing!" "You couldn't, not if you tried till doomsday," scoffed Mary Poppins, but the Starling was too happy to care. "A girl!" he shrieked, dancing on his toes. "I've had 3 broods this season, and would you believe it? Every one of them boys. But Annabel will make up to me for that." He hopped a little along the sill. "Annabel!" he burst out again. "That's a nice name. I had an aunt called Annabel. Used to live in Admiral Boone's chimney, and died, poor thing, of eating green apples and grapes. I warned her, but she wouldn't believe me, so of course—" "Will you be quiet?" demanded Mary Poppins, making a dive at him with her apron. "I will not," he shouted, dodging neatly. "This is no time for silence. I'm going to spread the news." He swooped out of the window. "Back in 5 minutes," he screamed at her over his shoulder, and he darted away. Mary Poppins moved quietly about the nursery, putting Annabel's new clothes in a neat pile. The sunlight, slipping in at the window, crept across the room and up to the cradle. "Open your eyes," it said softly, "and I'll put a shine on them." The coverlid of the cradle trembled. Annabel opened her eyes. "Good girl," said the sunlight. "They're blue, I see, my favorite color. There, you won't find a brighter pair of eyes anywhere." It slipped lightly out of Annabel's eyes and down the side of the cradle. "Thank you very much," said Annabel politely. A warm breeze stirred the muslin flounces of her head. "Curls are straight," it whispered, dropping into the cradle beside her. "Oh, curls, please," said Annabel softly. "It does save trouble, doesn't it?" agreed the breeze, and it moved over her head, carefully turning up the feathery edges of her hair before it fluttered off across the room. Here we are! A harsh voice shrilled from the window. The Starling had returned to the sill, and behind him, wobbling uncertainly as he alighted, came a very young bird. Mary Poppins moved toward them threateningly. "Now you be off," she said angrily. "I'll have no sparrows littering up this nursery." But the Starling, with the young one at his side, brushed haughtily past her. "Kindly remember, Mary Poppins," he said icily, that all my families are properly brought up. Littering, indeed." He alighted neatly on the edge of the cradle and steadied the fledgling beside him. The young bird stared about him with round, inquisitive eyes. The Starling hopped along to the pillow. "Annabel, dear," he began in a husky, wheedling voice, "I am very partial to a nice, crisp, crunchy piece of arrowroot biscuit." His eyes twinkled greedily. "You haven't one about you, I suppose?" The curled head stirred on the pillow. "No. Well, you're young yet for biscuits, perhaps. Your sister Barbara, nice girl she was, very generous and pleasant, always remembered me. So, if in the future you could spare the old fellow a crumb or two—" "Of course I will," said Annabel from the folds of the blanket. "Good girl!" croaked the Starling approvingly. He cocked his head to one side and gazed at her with his round, bright eye. "I hope," he remarked politely, "you are not too tired after your journey." Annabel shook her head. "Where has she come from? Out of an egg?" cheeped the fledgling suddenly. "Ha! Ha!" scoffed Mary Poppins. "Do you think she's a sparrow?" The Starling gave her a pained and haughty look. "Well, what is she, then? And where did she come from?" cried the fledgling shrilly, flapping his short wings, staring down at the cradle. "You tell him, Annabel," the Starling croaked. Annabel moved her hands inside the blanket. "I am earth and air and fire and water," she said softly. "I come from the dark where all things have their beginning." "Ah, such dark," said the Starling softly, bending his head to her breast. "It was dark in the egg, too," the fledgling cheeped. "I come from the sea and the tides," Annabel went on. "I come from the sky and its stars. I come from the sun and its brightness." "Ah, so bright," said the starling, nodding. "And I come from the forest of earth." As if in a dream, Mary Poppins rocked the cradle to and fro, with a steady swinging movement. "Yes," whispered the fledgling. "Slowly I moved at first," said Annabel, "always sleeping and dreaming. I remembered all I had been, and I thought of all I shall be, and when I had dreamed my dream I awoke and came swiftly." She paused for a moment, her blue eyes full of memories. "And then," prompted the fledgling, "I heard the stars singing as I came, and I felt warm wings about me. I passed the beasts of the jungle, and came to the dark, deep waters. It was a long journey." Annabel was silent. The fledgling stared at her with his bright, inquisitive eyes. Mary Poppins' hand lay quietly on the side of the cradle. She had stopped rocking. "A long journey indeed," said the starling softly, lifting his head from his breast. "And so soon forgotten." Annabel stirred under the quilt. "No," she said confidently, "I'll never forget." "Stuff and nonsense, beaks and claws, of course you will. By the time this week's out, you won't remember a word of it. What you are, or where you came from." Inside her flannel petticoat, Annabel was kicking furiously. I will. How could I forget?" "Because they all do," jeered the starling harshly. "Every human except," he nodded his head at Mary Poppins, "her. She is different. She is the oddity. She is the misfit." "You sparrow!" cried Mary Poppins, making a dart at him. But with a rude laugh, he swept the fledgling off the edge of the cradle and flew with him to the window-sill. "Tipped you last," he said cheekily as he brushed by. "Hullo, what's that?" There was a chorus of voices outside on the landing and a clatter of feet on the stairs. "I don't believe you. I won't believe you," cried Annabel wildly. And at that moment Jane and Michael and the twins burst into the room. "Mrs. Brill says you've got something to show us," said Jane, flinging off her hat. "What is it?" demanded Michael, gazing round the room. "Show me, me too," shrieked the twins. Mary Poppins glared at them. "Is this a decent nursery or the zoological gardens?" she inquired angrily. "Answer me that." "The zoo, Michael broke off hurriedly, for he had caught Mary Poppins' eye. "I mean a nursery," he said lamely. "Oh, look, Michael, look!" Jane cried excitedly. "I told you something important was happening. It's a new baby. Oh, Mary Poppins, can I have it to keep?" Mary Poppins, with a furious glance at them all, stooped and lifted Annabel out of the cradle and sat down with her in the old armchair. "Gently, please, gently," she warned, as they crowded about her. "This is a baby, not a battleship." "A baby boy?" asked Michael. "No, a girl, Annabel." Michael and Annabel stared at each other. He put his finger into her hand, and she clutched it tightly. "My doll," said John, pushing up against Mary Poppins' knee. "My rabbit," said Barbara, tugging at Annabel's shawl. "Oh," breathed Jane, touching the hair that the wind had curled, "how very small she is, like a star. Where did you come from, Annabel?" Very pleased to be asked, Annabel began her story again. "I came from the dark," she recited softly. Jane laughed. "Such funny little sounds," she cried. "I wish she could talk and tell us." Annabel stared. "But I am telling you," she protested, kicking. "Ha-ha!" shrieked the starling rudely from the window. "What did I say? Excuse me laughing." The fledgling giggled behind his wing. "Perhaps she came from a toy shop," said Michael. Annabel, with a furious movement, flung his finger from her. "Don't be silly," said Jane. "Dr. Simpson must have brought her in his little brown bag." "Was I right or was I wrong?" The starling's old dark eyes gleamed tauntingly at Annabel. "Tell me that," he jeered, flapping his wings in triumph. But for answer, Annabel turned her face against Mary Poppins' apron and wept. Her first cries, thin and lonely, rang piercingly through the house. "There, there," said the starling gruffly. "Don't take on. It can't be helped. You're only a human child after all, but next time, perhaps, you'll believe your betters. Elders and betters, elders and betters," he screamed, prancing conceitedly up and down. "Michael, take my feather duster, please, and sweep those birds off the sill," said Mary Poppins ominously. A squawk of amusement came from the starling. "We can sweep ourselves off, Mary Poppins, thank you. We were just going anyway. Come along, boy." And with a loud clucking chuckle, he flicked the fledgling over the sill and swooped with him through the window. In a very short time, Annabel settled down comfortably to life in Cherry Tree Lane. She enjoyed being the center of attraction, and was always pleased when somebody leant over her cradle and said how pretty she was, or how good or sweet-tempered. "Do go on admiring me," she would say, smiling. "I like it so much." And then they would hasten to tell her how curly her hair was, or how blue her eyes, and Annabel would smile in such a satisfied way that they would cry, "How intelligent she is! You would almost think she understood." But that always annoyed her, and she would turn away in disgust at their foolishness, which was silly, because when she was disgusted she looked so charming that they became more foolish than ever. She was a week old before the Starling returned. Mary Poppins, in the dim glow of the nightlight, was gently rocking the cradle when he appeared. "Back again?" snapped Mary Poppins, watching him prance in. "You're as bad as a bad penny." She gave a long, disgusted sniff. "I've been busy," said the Starling. "Have to keep my affairs in order. And this isn't the only nursery I have to look after, you know." His beady black eyes twinkled wickedly. "Humph," she said shortly. "I'm sorry for the others." He chuckled and shook his head. "Nobody like her," he remarked chirpily to the blind tassel. "Nobody like her. She's got an answer for everything." He cocked his head toward the cradle. "Well, how are things, Annabel? Asleep?" "No thanks to you if she is," said Mary Poppins. The Starling ignored the remark. He hopped to the end of the sill. "I'll keep watch," he said in a whisper. "You go down and get a cup of tea." Mary Poppins stood up. "Mind you don't wake her, then." The Starling laughed pityingly. "My dear girl, I have in my time brought up at least 20 broods of fledglings. I don't need to be told how to look after a mere baby." "Humph," said Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins walked to the cupboard and very pointedly put the biscuit tin under her arm before she went out and shut the door. The Starling marched up and down the window sill, backwards and forwards, with his wing-tips under his tail feathers. There was a small stir in the cradle. Annabel opened her eyes. "Hello," she said. "I was waiting to see you." "Ha!" said the Starling, swooping across to her. There's something I wanted to remember," said Annabel, "and I thought you might remind me." He started. His black eye glittered. "How does it go?" he said softly. "Like this?" He began in a husky whisper. "I am earth and air and fire and water." "No, no," said Annabel impatiently. "Of course it doesn't." "Well," said the Starling anxiously, "was it about your journey? You came from the sea and its tides, you came from the sky, and—" "Oh, don't be so silly," cried Annabel. "The only journey I ever took was to the park and back again this morning. No, no, it was something important, something beginning with B." She crowed suddenly. "I've got it," she cried. "It's biscuit. Half an arrowroot biscuit on the mantelpiece. Michael left it there after tea." "Is that all?" said the Starling sadly. "Of course," said Annabel fretfully. "Isn't it enough? I thought you'd be glad of a nice piece of biscuit." So I am, said the Starling hastily, "but—" She turned her head to the pillow and closed her eyes. "Don't talk any more now, please," she said. "I want to go to sleep." The Starling glanced across at the mantelpiece, down again at Annabel. "Biscuits," he said, shaking his head. "Alas, Annabel, alas." Mary Poppins came in quickly and closed the door. "Did she wake?" she said in a whisper. The Starling nodded. "Only for a minute," he said sadly, "but it was long enough." Mary Poppins' eyes questioned him. "She's forgotten," he said, with a catch in his croak. "She's forgotten it all. I knew she would. But my dear, what a pity." "Humph!" Mary Poppins moved quietly about the nursery, putting the toys away. She glanced at the Starling. He was standing on the window-sill with his back to her, and his speckled shoulders were heaving. "Caught another cold?" she remarked sarcastically. He wheeled around.